This is the story of one man caught up in conflicts between four different empires at the end of the 19th century. His story is told in the book The Washing of the Spears, The Rise and Fall of the Zulu Nation. Let's begin in early 1879, when Royal Navy ships arrived in Durban, South Africa, to support the British Empire's second invasion of the Zulu Empire. The ships carried soldiers, horses, guns, and supplies for the invasion. Among the soldiers was a young Frenchman who dressed as a British lieutenant, but wore no insignia because, as the book states, he held neither rank nor position within the army. Born in 1856, he was called by his given name Louis. His full name was Napoleon Eugene Louis Jean Joseph Bonaparte. Louis's father was Napoleon III, the Emperor of France in the 1850s and 60s. His father's uncle was none other than Napoleon Bonaparte, the Emperor of France and nearly all of Europe in the early 19th century. That made Louis the son and great-nephew of two emperors, and put him in line to rule the next empire should it ever come to pass. He was also known officially as the Prince Imperial. As a young man, Louis accompanied his father to see the war between the French and Prussian empires. When the French lost, Louis and his mother Eugene fled to England. After some hard years in a new country with lack of purpose, he entered the Royal Military Academy at Woolwich. There he struggled to gain acceptance as a foreign royal outcast. The other cadets nicknamed him Napoleon IV. Eventually, his fellow cadets accepted him as an equal. At graduation in 1875, Louis stood first in writing, first in fencing, and seventh in overall merit in a class of 34 cadets. He had been a phenomenal success after all. A few years later, news arrived of the disastrous British defeat at Isandlwana during their first invasion of the Zulu Empire in southern Africa. Preparations were made for a second invasion. Louis immediately requested to join them. Some in British High Command were reluctant to permit it, but Louis's mother Eugene and even Queen Victoria of England supported his request. It never crossed her mind that the slightest risk was involved. He was only to be a spectator, and the entire British army was there to protect him. And so the Prince Imperial arrived in Durban as a guest of the British army. At his side, he carried the sword his great-uncle, Napoleon Bonaparte, had carried in battle almost 75 years earlier. Commander of British forces was Lord Chelmsford. He was faced with the reorganization of his entire force and the job of mounting a second invasion of Zululand, and he had little time to spare for a feverishly enthusiastic young man who wanted to be in the thick of the campaign, but his neck was too valuable to risk. In April, the army marched north from Durban to begin the expedition. They traveled over 400 miles to Pietermaritzburg, Kambula, and Utrecht, where Lord Chelmsford set up his new headquarters. On May 13, 200 men of the Frontier Light Horse set out from a camp outside Utrecht to scout a path for one of the army's columns. Louis requested to join them. His request was granted because of the low risk of them meeting hostile forces. When a few Zulu scouts were sighted, Louis joined a small group of horsemen pursuing them and rode out alone multiple times, far ahead of his companions. The officer in charge of the group could not wait to get back to camp and get Louis off his hands. A few days later, a much smaller party of less than 30 horsemen set out to scout a different area of the land. Louis managed to join them too. They ended up approaching a small Zulu village called a kraal and received a few gunshots off the boulders around them. Louis enthusiastically joined the chase, but they found the village empty. After continuing east, they reached the end of their planned scouting journey. They rode back through the night, trailed by Zulu scouts the whole way, and reached camp by daybreak. In early June, an even smaller group of 9 riders, including the Prince Imperial and a Zulu guide, set out on another patrol. The area had already been cleared of Zulus, or so the army thought. About 12:30, they halted for a while. Louis had seen a deserted kraal a mile or two ahead, and he decided to descend from the bare ridge to boil coffee. By 3 o'clock they had reached it. Coffee was soon boiling, and the men stretched at ease, drinking and smoking. At 3:30, their Zulu guide returned to report that he had seen a solitary Zulu moving over a nearby rise. As soon as Louis heard the report, he ordered the men to collect their horses. The men gathered the reins, grasped their saddles, and put their left feet in the stirrups. But the command to mount was lost in the ear-splitting crash of a volley that ripped out of the 6-foot-tall grass a few yards away, stampeding the horses. 40 Zulus burst out of the edge of the grass, screaming "Usuthu" and bounding after the frantic horses. Most of the men had reached the saddle, and their horses carried them off to the dry riverbed. Louis could not mount. For over 100 yards he clung to the holster, until the strap holding the holster gave away, and Louis slipped and fell under the horse. He rose to his feet, groping for his great-uncle's sword. It was gone. He drew his revolver and ran down the sloping bed of an arm of the donga. The Zulus, far fleeter, raced after him, and in a widening of the ravine, by a little mound, he turned at bay. 7 Zulus were coming up, and a man in the lead threw an assegai that caught Louis in the thigh. Louis pulled it out and rushed at him. He fired twice and missed. Another Zulu hurled his assegai and struck Louis deep in the left shoulder. For a moment he held them back, fighting desperately with the assegai and using his left arm to ward off blows, so that he was unable to fire again. More Zulus were dropping into the donga, and he finally sank to a sitting position, exhausted by loss of blood. There was a brief hacking flurry, and it was all over. The survivors of the patrol finally gained control of their horses and gathered about 200 yards away from where the attack had started. One of the original group had been shot in the back, while 3 were missing: the Zulu guide, a cavalryman who had retreated on foot between the huts, and Louis. The officer in charge, Lieutenant Carey, took stock of their situation. He was certain that Louis had been killed. They did not have enough men to search for their missing companions, especially while outnumbered by dozens or more Zulu warriors moving through the tall grass and hills. There was nothing at all to be gained by staying, and nothing to do but to ride back to their new camp at Italezi Hill. The 5 men wheeled and rode north away from the donga. Near sunset, the officers of the camp greeted them with disbelief and scorn at the story of lost men left behind in enemy territory. Lord Chelmsford turned down the idea of an immediate sally, but ordered a major force to search at daybreak. Over 1,000 men were going to bring back Louis's body. All the English cavalry and all the mounted volunteers, the National Cadet Corps Battalion, and an ambulance unit. They searched near the dry riverbed, soon finding the bodies of the 2 cavalrymen, stabbed and stripped naked. Then they found Louis. He lay stiff and cold on his back, with no less than 17 separate wounds. His right hand still clutched a fistful of Zulu hair. The ground was bloody and trampled for yards about. All the wounds were in the front, and he had died facing his foes. The ambulance unit carried his body back to camp, where it began the long journey back to the coast. There were funeral ceremonies all along the way, including in Durban, as illustrated here. The coffin was transshipped to HMS Orontes at Cape Town, and there were further ceremonies attended by all who could reach the ship. From there they took Louis back to England. The news had reached England by telegraph on the 19th of June. Queen Victoria could barely comprehend it. Louis and his mother had been guests of England. Now he had gotten himself killed, despite the presence of an entire British army to protect him, and the only English officer who had been with him at the end had abandoned him and survived unscathed. At first, Louis's mother Eugene could not believe the news. Then she uttered one terrible cry and sank to the floor. She was senseless for several hours, and was only semi-conscious for the next 2 days, neither eating nor drinking. The news horrified the population of England, as the British defeat at the Battle of Isandlwana had never done. By press coverage alone, it ranked as the most stirring event of the year. It was in France, however, that the storm burst in all its fury. Anglophobia, that was never far from the surface, burst forth in a frenzied rage. Meanwhile, the Prince Imperial was buried at St. Mary's Church in the village of Chislehurst. 40,000 people attended the funeral, including Queen Victoria, but not Louis's mother, who had stayed up all night with the casket and did not attend the service. The repercussions of the tragedy continued for years. Lieutenant Carey was court-martialed and tried to lie his way out of trouble by saying he was not in charge of the patrol. He was found guilty and sentenced to a mild punishment. Unfortunately, he could not stop talking about the event, defending himself and blaming Louis. Eventually, a letter surfaced which he had written to his wife on the evening of the Prince Imperial's death. In the letter, he admitted his responsibilities and guilt, and so his career was ruined. Louis's mother, Eugene, recovered as best she could. Amazingly, she traveled to southern Africa a year later, after the British won the war, and actually met some of the men who had killed her son. One of the warriors said they would never have killed the white man, who fought like a lion, had they known who he was. Eugene planted a willow and an ivy shoot in the donga. She retired from public life and traveled around Europe quietly for the rest of her life. So ends the story of the heroic last stand of Napoleon Bonaparte's great-nephew. By heroic, I mean courageous, not meaning to imply that the cause he fought for was right or wrong. Empires clash as they always do, so let's take a minute to remember those who showed great courage in the face of it. They tried their best and made their mark on history, even if it was a small mark. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to this channel for new videos every week or two, and see the description below for a list of films and books featured in this video.